There was a boy in the Bronx who carried a camera the way other boys carried baseball gloves, and he moved through the streets of New York in the 1940s with the stillness of someone much older, watching light fall across fire escapes and strangers' faces with a kind of patient hunger that had nothing to do with childhood. He was not yet 16. The camera had been a gift, or perhaps a loan. The stories differ, but what mattered was that he learned to see through it before he learned to see any other way. He would ride the subway for hours, waiting for a frame to resolve itself, for the geometry of a crowded platform or an empty car to become something more than what it appeared to be. He was teaching himself composition the way some people teach themselves languages, by immersion, by repetition, by refusing to look away. His name was Stanley Kubrick, and he had been born in the Bronx on July 26, 1928, into a world that was about to collapse and remake itself. His father was a doctor, Jacob Kubrick, a man who valued precision and intellect and who would, when Stanley was 12, give him a camera and thereby set in motion everything that followed. His mother, Sadie, called him Stanley, never Stan, and there was something in the formality of that choice that seemed to suit the boy who would become the man, always a little distant, always observing. They were a Jewish family in an American city, assimilated but aware, comfortable but not wealthy, and Stanley grew up in the long shadow of the Depression and then the war, watching newsreels and reading pulp magazines and learning that the world was larger and stranger and more violent than the tree-lined streets of his neighborhood suggested. He was not a good student. This is worth stating plainly, because it shaped everything. He was bright, everyone agreed on that, but he had no patience for the structures of formal education, no interest in performing for teachers or following curricula that bored him. He read what he wanted to read, which was everything and nothing in particular: science fiction, chess theory, photography manuals, whatever crossed his path. He went to the movies obsessively, sometimes seeing the same film multiple times in a week, studying how scenes were built, how cuts worked, how a director could control what you saw and when you saw it. He was teaching himself in the dark of movie theaters the way he taught himself photography in the streets, by watching, by absorbing, by developing an internal sense of what worked and what didn't, that had nothing to do with anyone else's rules. The camera his father gave him was a Graflex, a medium-format camera that required thought and care, and Stanley took to it with the focused intensity that would define the rest of his life. He began taking pictures of everything: his family, his neighborhood, strangers on the street, and what emerged from those early frames was already something distinctive. He had an eye for geometry, for the way bodies arranged themselves in space, for the strange loneliness of public places. There was something almost clinical in his gaze, a willingness to observe without sentimentalizing, to let a scene be what it was, without imposing a narrative on it. He joined the photography club at William Howard Taft High School, where he was otherwise failing most of his classes, and he began to understand that this was the language he spoke. This was the grammar that made sense to him. When he was 17, still in high school and with no prospects for college given his grades, he walked into the offices of Look magazine with a photograph he had taken of a newsstand vendor the day after Franklin Roosevelt died. The image showed the vendor slumped behind his stand, surrounded by newspapers with headlines announcing the president's death, and there was in the composition a kind of collective grief made singular, a moment of national mourning compressed into one man's posture. The editors at Look bought the photograph, then they bought another, and then, in 1945, when Stanley was still 17 years old, they hired him as a staff photographer. For the next 5 years, Stanley Kubrick worked as a photojournalist, and the education he received in those years was worth more than any film school could have offered him. He learned to work quickly, to see a story in a single frame, to understand that every photograph was a choice about what to include and what to exclude. He photographed boxers and showgirls, jazz musicians and commuters, the famous and the anonymous. He learned lighting by necessity, composition by instinct, and timing by missing shots until he stopped missing them. He was still a teenager when he started, and by the time he left Look in 1950, he was 22, and he had produced hundreds of photo essays, each one a small lesson in visual storytelling. But photography was not enough. Or rather, it was complete in itself, and Stanley was beginning to understand that he wanted something less complete, something that moved and breathed and extended through time. He had been going to the movies his entire life, but now he began going differently, studying them with the same systematic attention he had brought to photography. He would sit through double features at the Museum of Modern Art, watching Eisenstein and Ophuls and Wells, rewinding them in his mind, trying to understand how they worked. Max of Fools in particular obsessed him the long tracking shots, the camera moving through space with a fluidity that seemed almost impossible, the way a single unbroken take could create a sense of inevitability, of fate unfolding in real time. Stanley studied those shots the way a musician studies scales, and he began to imagine what it would be like to make something that moved like that, something that could hold a viewer inside a continuous stream of time and image. He had also, by this point, become a serious chess player. He played in Washington Square Park for money, hustling games with the speed and calculation of someone who understood that chess was not about inspiration, but about seeing further ahead than your opponent, about controlling space and eliminating possibilities until only one path remained. He joined the Marshall Chess Club and played in tournaments, and though he was never quite good enough to be a master, he was good enough to understand the game's deeper logic, its patterns and structures. Chess taught him patience. It taught him that the most obvious move was often wrong, that you had to think several steps ahead, that every choice closed off certain futures and opened others. He would later say that making a film was like playing chess, and he meant it literally, the same patience, the same calculation, the same need to control every element of a complex system. In 1951, Stanley made his first film. It was called Day of the Fight, a 16-minute documentary about a boxer named Walter Cartier, and Stanley financed it himself with money he had saved from his photography work. He borrowed a camera, hired a small crew, and spent weeks filming Cartier as he prepared for a fight at Laurel Garden in Newark. The film is simple, almost austere, no voice-over narration, just the rhythms of a day in a fighter's life, the rituals and routines, the moment of violence that everything builds toward. It cost him $3,900 to make, and he sold it to RKO for $4,000, making a profit of $100 and proving to himself that this was possible, that he could teach himself to make films the way he had taught himself to make photographs. He followed it with Flying Padre, another short documentary, this one about a priest in New Mexico who flew a plane to visit his parishioners, scattered across the desert. Then came The Seafarers, a film about the Seafarers International Union, made as a promotional piece, but notable because it was Stanley's first film in color. None of these films were masterpieces. They were exercises, apprentice work, a young man learning a medium by doing it over and over until the language became fluent. But even in these early shorts, you could see the beginnings of a sensibility, a fondness for tracking shots, a willingness to let scenes play out in real time, a preference for observation over commentary. Stanley knew he needed to make a feature. He had no connections in Hollywood, no film school pedigree, no way into the system except to make something so undeniable that the system would have to pay attention. So in 1953, he made Fear and Desire, a war film about 4 soldiers stranded behind enemy lines in an unnamed conflict. He financed it with money borrowed from relatives and friends, shot it in the San Gabriel Mountains outside Los Angeles with a tiny crew, and edited it himself in a small apartment. The film cost around $40,000 and took months to complete. It was released in 1953 to polite indifference, and Stanley would later disown it, calling it amateurish and pretentious. But it was a feature film, it existed, and it proved that he could sustain a narrative across 90 minutes. What mattered more was what he learned making it, that he preferred working with a small crew, where he could control every element, that he would rather do a job himself than delegate it to someone who might not understand his vision. That filmmaking was not a collaborative art in the way people claimed, but a totalizing one, where a single intelligence had to govern every choice, or the whole thing would fall apart. He was not yet 30, and he was already developing the reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. Obsessive, controlling, impossible to work with, a perfectionist in the most literal and most exhausting sense of the word. His second feature, Killer's Kiss, came in 1955 and was another low-budget noir, this one about a boxer and a dance hall girl, and the mobster who comes between them. It was pulp, but it was self-aware pulp, and Stanley shot it with a stark, high-contrast style that owed as much to tabloid photography as to film noir. There is a fight scene near the end, set in a mannequin warehouse, that already shows the visual intelligence that would define his later work, the body struggling among the dismembered limbs of department store dummies, the uncanny doubling of human and inhuman forms, the way violence can be made both more brutal and more abstract by the spaces it occurs in. But it was The Killing, released in 1956, that announced Stanley Kubrick as a filmmaker worth paying attention to. It was a heist film based on a novel by Lionel White, and it told the story of a racetrack robbery that goes wrong in every possible way. What made it distinctive was its structure. Stanley told the story out of order, jumping back and forth in time to show the same events from different perspectives, a technique that was unusual then and would become commonplace later. The film was lean and brutal and formally precise, and it showed that Stanley understood genre not as a limitation but as a framework within which you could do almost anything. The Killing was not a commercial success, but it was a critical one, and it got him noticed by people who could give him bigger budgets and better actors. Sterling Hayden, the lead actor in The Killing, later said that working with Stanley was like being examined under a microscope. He meant it as a compliment, but there was something in the phrasing that captured what it was like to be on one of his sets. Stanley watched everything. He noticed when an actor's hand moved differently between takes, when a line reading shifted slightly in emphasis, when the light changed by a degree. He was not cruel, exactly, he did not yell or berate, but he was relentless. He would do take after take, not because the actors were doing anything wrong, but because he was looking for something that he could not quite articulate, a quality of reality or unreality that would emerge only through repetition. Some actors loved it, some hated it, none of them forgot it. His next film was Paths of Glory, released in 1957, and it was the first film that felt fully like a Stanley Kubrick film, the first one where the vision and the execution were entirely his, where every frame felt like it had been thought through with absolute clarity. It was set during World War I and told the story of 3 French soldiers court-martialed for cowardice after a disastrous assault on a German position. The film was based on a novel by Humphrey Cobb, and it was a savage indictment of the mechanisms of military power, the way institutions protect themselves by sacrificing individuals, the way honor and glory are revealed to be rhetorical constructs that have nothing to do with the reality of men dying in mud. Stanley shot the battle scenes with a brutality that was almost documentary-long, tracking shots through the trenches, the camera following soldiers as they climbed out into no man's land and were cut down by machine gun fire, the chaos rendered with a strange, implacable steadiness. And then he shot the trial scenes with a formal rigidity that mirrored the rigidity of the military court, wide static shots that made the courtroom look like a theater where a preordained ritual was being performed. The contrast between the chaos of the battlefield and the cold logic of the courtroom was the film's moral architecture, and it was built into the visual grammar of every scene. Kirk Douglas, who starred in the film and who had enough clout to get it made, later said that Stanley was the most talented young director he had ever worked with, and also the most difficult. Stanley wanted control over every aspect of the production, and he fought for it over casting, over the script, over the final cut. He did not compromise easily, and he did not care if his stubbornness made him unpopular. He cared about the film, and he believed, rightly or not, that no one else could be trusted to care about it as much as he did. Paths of Glory was a commercial failure in America and was banned in France for years because of its unflattering portrayal of the French military. But it established Stanley as a serious artist, someone who could work within the studio system but was not entirely of it, someone who made films that were formally rigorous and morally uncompromising and very, very cold. There is almost no warmth in Paths of Glory. There is anger and there is pity, but it is pity observed from a great distance, as if Stanley were documenting human suffering the way an entomologist documents insects. It was during the making of Paths of Glory that Stanley met Christine Harlan, a German actress who appeared in the film's final scene, singing a German folk song to a room full of French soldiers who are about to return to the front. The scene is heartbreaking, one of the few moments of genuine tenderness in Stanley's entire body of work, and it is not incidental that the woman singing became his wife. They married in 1958, and Christiane would remain with him for the rest of his life, raising their children, painting her own work, providing a kind of stability that Stanley seemed to need, even as he built a life that was increasingly isolated from the world. After Paths of Glory, Stanley was offered Spartacus, a big-budget historical epic about a slave revolt in ancient Rome. He did not want to do it. He had no interest in spectacle for its own sake, and he knew that on a production that large, with that many producers and that much money at stake, he would not have the control he was used to. But Kirk Douglas, who was producing and starring in the film, convinced him, and Stanley, who was still only 30 years old and still proving himself, agreed. Spartacus was released in 1960, and it was a success, both commercially and critically, but Stanley disowned it almost immediately. He called it the only film he had made where he did not have final cut, the only one where he felt like a director for hire rather than an artist. He hated the experience of working with a large crew, of having to answer to producers and studio executives, of making creative decisions by committee. The film itself is spectacular in places. There are shots of thousands of extras arranged in geometric formations, battles choreographed with almost mathematical precision, but it does not feel like a Stanley Kubrick film. It feels like a Stanley Kubrick film directed by someone else. The lesson he took from Spartacus was simple. Never again. He would never again make a film where he did not have absolute control, and he would structure the rest of his career around ensuring that control. He moved to England in part because he could work more cheaply there, in part because the distance from Hollywood made it harder for studios to interfere. He negotiated contracts that gave him final cut as a non-negotiable condition. He became, in effect, a one-man studio, producing his own films, supervising every stage of production from script to marketing, trusting no one but himself and a very small circle of collaborators. In 1962, Stanley released Lolita, an adaptation of Vladimir Nabokov's novel about a middle-aged man's obsession with a 12-year-old girl. It was, on its face, an impossible project. How do you film a book that is narrated by a pedophile and make it something other than pornographic or exploitive? Stanley solved the problem by making the film almost entirely about evasion, about what could not be shown and could not be said. He cast Su Leong, who was 14 during filming but looked older, and he shot the film with a kind of glancing indirection, always cutting away before the scenes could become explicit, letting the horror of the situation exist in what was implied rather than what was depicted. James Mason, who played Humbert, understood what Stanley was doing, creating a film where the audience was complicit in Humbert's self-delusion, where the surface charm and wit of the narration made it easy to forget, momentarily, what was actually happening, and then Stanley would insert a scene look, a moment of discomfort that would remind you, and the complicity would curdle into shame. It was a film about the unreliability of narrators and the unreliability of audiences, about how easy it is to be seduced by a voice that knows how to flatter you. Peter Sellers, who played Claire Quilty, improvised many of his scenes, and Stanley led him, recognizing that Sellers's anarchic energy was the perfect counterpoint to Mason's controlled melancholy. Quilty was chaos, a kind of grotesque double of Humbert, and Sellers played him as a series of characters within a character, each one more unhinged than the last. The film begins with Quilty's murder, and the rest of the film is a long flashback explaining how we got there, and the structure itself is a kind of trap. You know where this is going, you know how it ends, and you watch anyway. Lolita was controversial, inevitably, but it was also a success, and it proved that Stanley could adapt literary material without losing what made the source material dangerous. He was not interested in faithful adaptations. He was interested in finding cinematic equivalents for literary effects, in translating one language into another, and he was willing to change anything: structure, tone, even plot if it served that translation. And then, in 1964, he released Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, and everything changed. Dr. Strangelove was a black comedy about nuclear annihilation, and it was the first film where Stanley's sensibility, his coldness, his formal precision, his fascination with institutional dehumanization, found a subject that was perfectly suited to it. The film is about the end of the world, and it is played as farce. The war room is shot like a cathedral, all high ceilings and long shadows, and the men who will decide whether to launch nuclear missiles are revealed to be petty, vain, paranoid, and absurd. The president is ineffectual. The general is insane. The scientist is a Nazi. And the doomsday device, when it is finally explained, turns out to have been built as a deterrent, but never announced, rendering its deterrent value null and its destructive capacity absolute. Stanley worked with Terry Southern on the script, and together they crafted a film that was both a satire of Cold War paranoia and a documentary of it, as if the satire and the reality were the same thing. Peter Sellers played 3 roles: the president, a British officer, and Dr. Strangelove himself, and each performance was a study in different kinds of powerlessness masquerading as control. George C. Scott, who played General Buck Turgidson, initially resisted Stanley's direction, but Stanley tricked him into giving the performance he wanted by asking Scott to do exaggerated, over-the-top takes, just for practice, and then using those takes in the final film. Scott was furious when he saw the result, but he could not deny that it worked. The film ends with nuclear explosions set to Vera Lynn singing "We'll Meet Again," and the juxtaposition is so unexpected, so formally audacious, that it becomes almost unbearable. The images are beautiful mushroom clouds blooming across the screen like flowers, and the song is sweet and nostalgic, and together they create a cognitive dissonance that the film makes no effort to resolve. Stanley was not interested in reassuring his audience. He was interested in making them feel the absurdity and the terror of the world they lived in, and he did it by making them laugh and then making them realize what they were laughing at. Dr. Strangelove was a critical and commercial success, and it established Stanley as one of the most important directors in the world. But even as the film was being released, he was already at work on something else, something so ambitious and so strange that no one, including Stanley, was entirely sure what it would become. He had read a short story by Arthur C. Clarke called The Sentinel about an alien artifact discovered on the moon, and he became obsessed with the idea of making a science fiction film that was not about bug-eyed monsters or Flash Gordon heroics, but about something larger and stranger, about human evolution, about first contact, about what it would mean to encounter an intelligence so far beyond our own that we could not even comprehend it. He reached out to Clarke, and the two of them began working together, Clarke writing a novel and Stanley writing a screenplay, each informing the other, the story evolving in 2 media simultaneously. The film that emerged from this collaboration was 2001, A Space Odyssey, and it is unlike anything that came before or after. It begins with apes. 4 million years ago, on the African savanna, a tribe of early hominids is struggling to survive, and one morning they wake to find a black monolith standing in their midst. The monolith does nothing. It simply is. And in its presence, one of the apes picks up a bone and realizes it can be used as a weapon. He kills an animal. Then he kills another ape. and Stanley cuts from the bones spinning through the air to a satellite spinning through space, and 4 million years of human history dissolve in a single edit. The film then moves to the year 2001, where a monolith has been discovered on the moon, buried deliberately, waiting. A mission is sent to Jupiter to investigate, and on that mission the ship's computer, AL-9000, begins to malfunction. Hal is calm and polite and utterly without mercy. He kills the crew one by one, not out of malice but out of logic, and the sole survivor, Dave Bowman, must dismantle him in a scene that is both a murder and a mercy killing. Hal's voice slows and distorts as his memory is erased, and he begins to sing a song, Daisy Bell. The first song ever sung by a computer, and the scene is heartbreaking in a way that has nothing to do with human emotion. And then the film moves beyond Jupiter, into the monolith, into a space where time and physics no longer apply, and Dave Bowman ages and dies and is reborn as the Star Child, a fetus floating in space, staring back at the Earth. The final images are silent and enigmatic and have been interpreted in 1,000 different ways, and Stanley refused to explain them, saying only that the film was meant to be experienced rather than understood. Stanley spent 4 years making 2001. He supervised the special effects himself, working with Douglas Trumbull and others to create images of space travel that looked more realistic than anything that had been done before. He insisted that the spacecraft move in silence because there is no sound in space, and he insisted that the technology look functional rather than fantastical, that every switch and panel and corridor feel like something that could actually exist. He shot the rotating space station set by building a giant centrifuge and mounting the camera inside it, so that actors could walk on the walls while the room spun around them. He did take after take after take, sometimes for reasons he could articulate and sometimes simply because something felt wrong. The film was released in 1968, and the initial response was mixed. Some critics walked out, some called it a masterpiece, some called it boring. But audiences, particularly young audiences, responded to it in a way that no one had anticipated. They saw it multiple times. They saw it while high. They treated it as an experience rather than a narrative, a film to be meditated on rather than decoded. Over time, 2001 became recognized as one of the most formally ambitious films ever made, a work that redefined what science fiction could be and what film itself could be. But the experience of making it left Stanley exhausted, and perhaps confirmed something he had always suspected, that total artistic control came at a cost, that the films he wanted to make required a level of obsession and isolation that was not sustainable, that the perfectionism he demanded of himself and others was both the source of his greatness and the thing that made him, in some fundamental way, unreachable. After 2001, Stanley retreated further into himself. He bought a large estate in Hertfordshire, England, and he rarely left it. He conducted business by phone. He avoided public appearances. He became, in the popular imagination, a recluse, a hermit, a man who had withdrawn from the world to pursue his art in absolute solitude. The reality was more mundane. He lived with his wife and children. He worked in his home. He simply preferred privacy to publicity. But the myth was more compelling, and myths have a way of overwhelming reality. His next film, A Clockwork Orange, was released in 1971 and was perhaps the most controversial film he ever made. Based on Anthony Burgess's novel, it told the story of Alex, a teenage delinquent in a near-future England who rapes and murders for fun and is then subjected to a government program that conditions him to feel physically ill at the thought of violence. The film was an exploration of free will, of whether it is better to choose evil than to have goodness imposed on you, and it was also a riot of color and style and choreographed brutality. Stanley shot the violence in A Clockwork Orange with a formalism that made it both more disturbing and more distancing. The rape scene is staged as a musical number. The fight scenes are choreographed like ballet. Alex narrates the film in a slangy, invented language called Nadsat, and his voice is charming and funny and utterly sociopathic, and the film forces you to spend 2 hours inside his head. Malcolm McDowell, who played Alex, gave a performance that was charismatic and terrifying, and he did it under Stanley's exacting direction, which included shooting the scene where Alex's eyes are held open with actual medical clamps, causing McDowell temporary eye damage. The film was a commercial success, but it was also blamed for inspiring copycat violence, and Stanley, who was receiving death threats, made the decision to withdraw the film from distribution in the United Kingdom. It would not be seen there again until after his death. The decision has been debated endlessly. Was it censorship? Was it cowardice? Was it a father protecting his family? But Stanley never explained it publicly, and the film's absence only added to its mythology. In 1975, Stanley released Barry Lyndon, an adaptation of William Makepeace Thackeray's novel about an Irish rogue who climbs and then falls from aristocratic society in 18th-century Europe. It was, on its surface, the least Stanley Kubrick film imaginable a period piece. A costume drama, a story about manners and class and very little else. But Stanley made it into something strange and beautiful and utterly his own. He shot the film using natural light wherever possible, and for interior scenes lit only by candlelight, he used special lenses developed by NASA for space photography, lenses that could capture images in almost no light at all. The result was that the film looked like a series of paintings come to life. Gainsborough, Hogarth, Watteau, each frame composed with the precision of a still photograph. The camera moved slowly, almost languorously through rooms and across landscapes, and the effect was hypnotic and distancing, as if you were watching events from a great remove, through a glass. Ryan O'Neal, who played Barry Lyndon, later said that Stanley treated the actors like objects to be arranged within the frame, that he cared more about the composition of a shot than about the emotional truth of a performance. This was not quite fair, but it was not quite wrong either. Stanley was making a film about the emptiness of ambition, the way a life can be consumed by striving for things that turn out to be hollow, and the film's formal beauty was inseparable from its emotional coldness. Barry Lyndon wins everything he wants and loses everything he has, and the film observes his rise and fall with the detachment of a historian narrating events that happened long ago to people who no longer matter. The film was not a commercial success. Audiences did not know what to make of it. Critics were divided, but over time, Barry Lyndon has come to be seen as one of Stanley's greatest achievements, a film that uses every tool of cinema light, composition, music, editing to create a specific and unrepeatable atmosphere, a film that is about nothing and everything, that is slow and demanding and rewards patience in ways that are difficult to articulate. Stanley spent 5 years making his next film, The Shining, and it is perhaps the purest distillation of his sensibility, formal precision in service of absolute terror. Based on Stephen King's novel, the film tells the story of Jack Torrance, a writer who takes a job as the winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel and slowly goes insane, eventually trying to murder his wife and son. King's novel was about alcoholism and domestic violence, and the ways trauma gets passed down through generations. Stanley's film was about something else, about the hotel itself, about architecture and space and the way buildings can contain malevolence, about the uncanny and the inhuman. Stanley shot the film using the newly developed Steadicam, a camera stabilization system that allowed for smooth, gliding shots through the hotel's corridors, and the effect was dreamlike and terrifying. The camera follows Danny, Jack's young son, as he rides his tricycle through the empty halls, and the silence is broken only by the sound of the wheels on the carpet, and then the hardwood, and then the carpet again, and the rhythm is hypnotic and unbearable. The hotel is full of symmetry, long hallways, identical doors, patterns that repeat, and the symmetry itself becomes oppressive, a kind of visual trap. Jack Nicholson, who played Jack Torrance, gave a performance that was both enormous and precise, playing Jack's descent into madness as something that was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting. Stanley pushed Shelley Duvall, who played Jack's wife Wendy, to the edge of her endurance, doing take after take of scenes where she was required to cry and scream and express terror, and the performance she gave was raw and exhausted and utterly convincing. Duvall later said the experience was the hardest of her career, and there has been ongoing debate about whether Stanley's methods were brilliant or abusive, whether the ends justified the means. The film was released in 1980, and Stephen King hated it, saying that Stanley had made a beautiful film with no heart, that he had removed everything that made the novel personal and replaced it with cold formalism. King was not entirely wrong, but he was missing the point. Stanley was not interested in making a faithful adaptation. He was interested in making a film about the terror of empty spaces, about what happens when a family is isolated and the structures that hold them together begin to break down, about the possibility that the hotel is not haunted but simply indifferent, and that indifference is worse than malice. The Shining has become one of the most iconic horror films ever made, endlessly analyzed and referenced, and its images, the twin girls in the hallway, the elevator of blood, the maze in the snow, have entered the collective unconscious. But at the time of its release, it was divisive, and Stanley, as always, did not explain himself, did not defend the film or engage with the criticism. He simply moved on to the next project. That project was Full Metal Jacket, released in 1987, and it was Stanley's return to the subject of war. The film is divided into two halves. The first half takes place in a Marine training camp where a brutal drill instructor breaks down recruits and rebuilds them into killers, and one recruit, who cannot be rebuilt, who remains himself, kills the instructor and then himself. The second half takes place in Vietnam, during the Tet Offensive, and it follows the same group of Marines as they move through the ruins of Hue, encountering chaos and death and the absurdity of trying to report on a war that defies narrative. Stanley shot the film in England, recreating Vietnam in abandoned industrial sites and a derelict gasworks, and the artificiality of the setting became part of the film's aesthetic. Everything in Full Metal Jacket feels slightly unreal, slightly staged, as if the war itself were a performance, a theater of cruelty. R. Lee Ermey, who played the drill instructor, was a former Marine drill instructor himself, and much of his dialogue was improvised, a stream of obscene poetry that was both hilarious and terrifying. The film structured two distinct halves that do not quite cohere into a single narrative, frustrated some viewers, but it was deliberate. Stanley was not interested in making a war film that followed the usual arc of boot camp to combat to resolution. He was interested in the gap between training and reality, and the way the military tries to impose order on chaos and fails. After Full Metal Jacket, Stanley spent more than a decade working on projects that were announced and then abandoned, scripts that were written and rewritten, films that existed only in his mind and in rumors. He worked on a film about the Holocaust and then decided he could not make it. He worked on a film about artificial intelligence, collaborating with Brian Aldiss on a story about a robot child who wants to become real, and he spent years developing it, but he never felt ready to shoot it, and eventually he passed the project to Steven Spielberg, who made it as AI artificial intelligence after Stanley's death. Stanley and Spielberg admired each other and were wary of each other. Two directors who represented opposite poles of American cinema, Spielberg warm and humanist and populist, Stanley cold and formalist and uncompromising. They spoke on the phone occasionally, and there was a mutual respect, but also a sense that they were speaking different languages, that the things one valued the other found suspect. Stanley's final film was Eyes Wide Shut, released in 1999, and it was a return to the territory of Lolita sexuality, obsession, the unreliability of desire. Based on Arthur Schnitzler's novella Traumnovelle, the film tells the story of a married couple, played by Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, whose relationship is thrown into crisis when the wife confesses to a fantasy of infidelity. The husband embarks on a strange, dreamlike journey through New York's sexual underworld, encountering masked orgies and prostitutes, and a sense of menace that never quite materializes into actual danger. Stanley shot the film over more than a year, an extraordinarily long shoot even by his standards, and he worked with Cruise and Kidman obsessively doing hundreds of takes of even simple scenes, searching for something that he could not name. The film is slow and deliberate, and suffused with a sense of unease, and it is difficult to say whether it is about sex or about the idea of sex, whether the journey the husband takes is real or a projection of his own fears and desires. The film was released 6 months after Stanley's death, and it was received with confusion and disappointment. It was not the erotic thriller that the marketing suggested. It was something stranger and colder, a film about the terror of intimacy, about what it means to live with another person and realize that you do not know them, that you cannot know them, that everyone is finally unknowable. Stanley Kubrick died on March 7, 1999, in his home in Hertfordshire, of a heart attack. He was 70 years old. He had finished editing Eyes Wide Shut just days before. He had shown it to a small group executives, collaborators, and he had approved the final cut. And then he was gone. His death was sudden, and the myths that surrounded him in life only intensified after it. He became the ultimate auteur, the director who had total control, who made films that were entirely his vision, who never compromised. The reality was more complicated. He did compromise, occasionally, when he had to. He did collaborate with writers and cinematographers and composers and actors, but he structured his life and his work to minimize those compromises, to ensure that the final decisions were always his, and in that sense, the myth was true. The films he left behind are strange and beautiful and difficult. They are not warm. They are not comforting. They do not offer easy answers or emotional catharsis. They are films that observe human beings as if from a great distance, with a clarity that is almost inhuman, and they ask whether that distance is wisdom or coldness, whether the precision of the filmmaking is a form of compassion or a form of control. There is a moment in 2001, after HAL's been dismantled, when Dave Bowman is alone in the ship, hurtling toward Jupiter, and the camera holds on his face as he eats a meal in silence, and the silence is absolute, and you realize that this is what space is: not adventure, not wonder, but emptiness, the final frontier as a void. And Stanley holds the shot longer than is comfortable, longer than any other director would, because he wants you to feel that emptiness, to sit with it, to understand that this is what it means to be alone in the universe. His influence is everywhere and nowhere. Every filmmaker who uses a Steadicam, who does long takes, who insists on control over the final cut, is working in the shadow of Stanley Kubrick. But almost no one makes films that feel like his, because his films are not about style. Exactly, they are about a specific kind of intelligence, a specific way of seeing the world, and that cannot be imitated, only admired from a distance. Christopher Nolan has cited him as an influence, and you can see it in the formal ambition of Interstellar and Dunkirk, in the willingness to trust the audience to sit with silence and ambiguity. Paul Thomas Anderson has spoken about him with reverence, particularly the way Stanley used music, the way he would find a piece of classical music and build a scene around it, letting the image and the sound create a meaning that neither could achieve alone. The Coen brothers, Darren Aronofsky, Wes Anderson, all of them have absorbed something from Stanley, some aspect of his technique or his sensibility, but none of them make films that sound like his. Stanley was not interested in emotion in the way most filmmakers are. He was interested in systems, the way institutions function, the way violence is organized, the way human beings deceive themselves. He was interested in the gap between what people say and what they do, between the stories they tell about themselves and the reality of their actions. And he made films that were cool and precise and formally perfect, films that showed you everything and explained nothing, films that trusted you to think. The coldness of the films is the thing people argue about. Some see it as a flaw, a lack of humanity, a refusal to engage with emotion. Others see it as a feature, a kind of intellectual rigor, a refusal to sentimentalize or manipulate. Stanley himself never weighed in on the debate. He did not give many interviews, and when he did, he was polite and evasive, unwilling to explain his intentions or defend his choices. He believed the films should speak for themselves, and if they did not, then no amount of explanation would help. There is a scene in Barry Lyndon where Barry's young son, Brian, is thrown from a horse and dies, and Stanley films the aftermath with a restraint that is almost unbearable. The camera does not ask you to cry. It simply observes the fact of the death and its consequences, and the effect is more devastating than any amount of emotional manipulation could be. The distance is the point. The refusal to comfort you is the point. Stanley's films are full of images that have become iconic. The bone becoming a satellite, Hal's red eye, the twins in the hallway, the Droogs in their white costumes, the war room, the monolith. But the images are not the point. The images are the means by which Stanley explored his obsessions. And the obsessions were always the same: the irrationality of human beings, the violence that lurks beneath civilization, the impossibility of control, the terror of the unknown. He was obsessed with evolution, with the idea that human beings are just animals with delusions of grandeur, that we like to think of ourselves as rational and moral and in control, but we are driven by instincts and desires that we do not understand and cannot master. 2001 is about evolution, from ape to human to something beyond human. A Clockwork Orange is about the failure of attempts to control human nature through conditioning. Full Metal Jacket is about the military's attempt to turn men into machines and the way that project fails and succeeds simultaneously. He was obsessed with institutions: the military, the government, the hotel, the family, and the way institutions dehumanize the people within them. Paths of Glory is about a military that sacrifices soldiers to protect its reputation. Dr. Strangelove is about a military that sacrifices soldiers to protect its reputation. Dr. Strangelove is about a government that builds doomsday devices because the logic of deterrence demands it. The Shining is about a family that isolates itself and discovers that the structures that held it together were fragile all along. He was obsessed with sex and violence, with the way power and desire are entangled, with the way eroticism and domination bleed into each other. Lolita is about a man who rationalizes his desire as love. A Clockwork Orange is about violence as aesthetic pleasure. Eyes Wide Shut is about a man who discovers that his wife has a secret life in her fantasies, and it unmoors him because he realizes that desire is not something that can be controlled or even fully known. And he was obsessed with looking, with the act of seeing and being seen, with cameras and eyes and the way observation changes what is observed. He was a photographer before he was a filmmaker, and he never stopped thinking like a photographer, thinking in terms of frames and compositions and light. His films are full of moments where characters look directly at the camera, breaking the fourth wall, implicating the audience in what is happening. Alex looks at us. Hal's eye is a camera lens. The Star Child looks back at Earth. Stanley's life after the mid-1970s was one of increasing seclusion. He worked from home, communicated by phone and fax, and rarely appeared in public. He watched thousands of movies on VHS, studying them, taking notes. He read voraciously history, science, philosophy, anything that caught his interest. He was a perfectionist, not just in his work, but in his life, and the two were not separable. Making a film was not something he did and then stopped doing. It was a process that consumed him entirely, that took years, and in between films he was still thinking, planning, preparing. He was not a recluse in the romantic sense. He did not withdraw from the world because he hated it. He withdrew because he needed control over his environment in order to work, and the world outside was too chaotic, too full of variables he could not manage. He had a small circle of collaborators. He trusted his wife Christiane, his brother-in-law and producer, Jan Harlan, a few key crew members, and he worked with them again and again, because trust was difficult for him, and once given was not easily transferred. His reputation as a tyrant on set was both earned and exaggerated. He did demand perfection. He did take after take until he got what he wanted, but he was not capricious. He knew what he was looking for, even if he could not always articulate it. And the people who worked with him longest understood that the obsessiveness came from a deep commitment to the work, not from cruelty or ego. Malcolm McDowell, despite the difficulties of A Clockwork Orange, remained fond of Stanley and spoke of him with admiration. Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, despite the grueling shoot of Eyes Wide Shut, both said that working with Stanley was one of the most important experiences of their careers. But there were actors who would not work with him again. Shelley Duvall, in particular, spoke about The Shining with pain, and in later interviews it became clear that Stanley's methods, his insistence on take after take, his willingness to push her to the edge of her emotional and physical endurance had left scars. The question of whether great art justifies suffering is one that each viewer has to answer for themselves, but it is a question that Stanley's films insist on asking. Stanley did not make films about hope. He did not believe in redemption, at least not in any conventional sense. His films end in ambiguity or despair, or, in the case of 2001, in transcendence that is so far beyond human understanding that it might as well be despair. The star child floats in space, staring at Earth, and we do not know if it is a new beginning or an ending, if humanity has evolved or been replaced, if this is a birth or an extinction. His films are not nihilistic exactly, because nihilism suggests a kind of carelessness, a shrug, and Stanley cared deeply. He cared about every frame, every cut, every sound, but they are pessimistic. They suggest that human beings are trapped by their nature, that free will is an illusion, that institutions exist to perpetuate themselves at the expense of the individuals within them, that violence is not an aberration, but a fundamental part of who we are. And yet people keep watching the films. They are not easy to watch, and they are not fun, but they are compelling in a way that is hard to explain. They pull you in. They make you think. They refuse to let you off the hook. You cannot watch A Clockwork Orange and not ask yourself whether you are complicit in the violence you are watching. You cannot watch 2001 and not wonder what it means to be human. You cannot watch The Shining and not feel the creeping dread of being trapped, of being alone, of losing yourself. The films are also, in their own way, beautiful. Stanley was a formalist, and he cared about beauty, not prettiness, but composition, symmetry, the way light falls, the way a camera moves. Barry Lyndon is one of the most beautiful films ever made, every frame a painting. 2001 is beautiful in its depiction of space, in the silence and the vastness and the terror of the infinite. Even A Clockwork Orange, with its violence and its ugliness, is shot with a kind of grotesque elegance, the droogs dancing through their crimes like performers in a nightmare ballet. Stanley believed that form and content were inseparable, that you could not tell a story about dehumanization using warm handheld cameras and natural light, that the coldness of the image was part of the meaning. He believed that every choice, the lens, the camera movement, the music, the edit, was a moral choice because it shaped how the audience experienced the story, what they felt and thought and understood. He was not always right. Some of his films are more successful than others. Some of his choices are questionable, but he was always intentional. Nothing in a Stanley Kubrick film is there by accident. Every frame has been thought through, every sound considered, every cut deliberate. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, that during the filming of The Shining, Stanley had the crew build the elaborate hedge maze set and then decided not to use it for most of the scenes, instead filming a model of the maze from above and cutting to it throughout the film. The set was expensive and time-consuming to build, and it exists in the film only as a few shots at the end, but Stanley wanted it to exist, wanted it to be real, because the reality of it would be felt even if it was not seen, and that is how he worked obsessively, exhaustively, with a commitment to a vision that did not make concessions to practicality or budget or anyone else's idea of what was reasonable. After his death, tributes poured in from filmmakers around the world. Steven Spielberg called him one of the greatest filmmakers who ever lived. Martin Scorsese said that Stanley had redefined what cinema could be. But the tributes also acknowledged the difficulty of the man and the work, the sense that Stanley was both an inspiration and a cautionary tale, that his level of control came at a cost that not everyone would be willing to pay. Eyes Wide Shut, his final film, was released to mixed reviews, and over the years it has been reassessed, as all of Stanley's films have been reassessed. It is a film about marriage, about the secrets people keep, about the fantasy life that exists beneath the surface of every relationship. It is slow and dreamlike and unsettling, and it does not offer resolution. The final line, spoken by Nicole Kidman's character, is a single obscene word, and it is both a punchline and a kind of resignation, an acknowledgement that desire is messy and irrational and cannot be contained by marriage or morality or any of the stories we tell ourselves. Stanley spent his entire career trying to control the uncontrollable human nature, institutional chaos, the randomness of existence, and his films are the record of that attempt. They are films about control made by a man who needed control to make them. And the irony is that the films themselves are about the failure of control, the way systems break down, the way people are undone by their own natures. He made 13 feature films over nearly 50 years, and each one is singular, each one unmistakably his. There is no such thing as a minor Stanley Kubrick film. Even the ones that are considered less successful, Killer's Kiss, Fear and Desire, are interesting, full of ideas and images that would be developed more fully in later work. And the great ones, 2001, Dr. Strangelove, The Shining, Paths of Glory, are as close to perfect as films get, each one a complete and coherent vision, each one a world unto itself. The question of whether Stanley was a great humanist or a cold technician, whether his films are compassionate or cruel, whether the perfectionism was genius or pathology. These questions do not have answers, or rather they have different answers depending on who is asking. The films contain the questions. They do not resolve them. There is a moment near the end of 2001 where Dave Bowman, having passed through the monolith, finds himself in a pristine, anonymous hotel room decorated in the style of 18th century France, and he ages rapidly, watching himself grow old in moments, and then he sees the monolith again, standing at the foot of his bed, and he reaches out toward it, and in the next shot he is the star child, and the music swells, and we do not know what has happened, whether he has died or been reborn, whether this is transcendence or annihilation. Stanley never explained it, and the people who worked on the film have offered different interpretations, and Arthur C. Clarke wrote a novel that explains it one way, and the film does not explain it at all. The film simply shows it, and the showing is enough, or it is not, depending on what you need from a film. Stanley believed that ambiguity was more honest than resolution, that life does not offer neat endings, that the most important questions do not have answers. He made films that trusted the audience to sit with uncertainty, to think, to argue, to come back to the film again and again and find new things in it, and people have. 2001 has been analyzed frame by frame. The Shining has inspired documentaries about its hidden meanings. Even his lesser-known films have devoted followings who see in them things that other viewers miss. He was not interested in being liked. He was interested in making films that mattered, that lasted, that were uncompromising. And he succeeded. The films are still here, still being watched, still provoking arguments and essays and imitations. They are difficult and cold and beautiful and strange, and they are entirely his. In his final years, Stanley lived quietly with Christiane, working on projects that would never be completed, watching films, reading, thinking. He had achieved everything he set out to achieve: total artistic control, a body of work that would endure, a place in the history of cinema that was secure. But he did not rest on that. He kept working, kept pushing, kept trying to make the next film, the one that would finally say what he was trying to say. He did not finish AI. He did not make the Napoleon film he had researched for years. He did not make the Holocaust film. These unmade films exist as ghosts in his filmography, as possibilities, as might-have-beens. But the films he did make are enough. They are more than enough. Stanley Kubrick was born in the Bronx in 1928 and died in Hertfordshire in 1999, and in between he made films that changed what cinema could be. He was a photographer who became a filmmaker, a chess player who thought in moves and countermoves, a perfectionist who believed that control was the only way to create something meaningful in a chaotic world. He was cold and brilliant, and obsessive and uncompromising, and the films he made are cold and brilliant, and obsessive and uncompromising, and they will outlast all of us. The last image of his last film is Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman in a toy store, having survived a night of temptation and crisis. And they are talking about what to do next, how to move forward, and the film ends mid-conversation, no resolution, just the acknowledgement that life continues, messy and uncertain, and that is all we get. Stanley understood that there are no answers, only questions, no resolutions, only the next frame, the next cut, the next film. He understood that control is an illusion, but he spent his life trying to achieve it anyway, because the trying was the point, the work was the point, and the films are what remain when everything else falls away. He made films about apes and astronauts, soldiers and criminals, ghosts and masked orgies, and all of them were about the same thing: what it means to be human in a universe that does not care, what it means to try to impose order on chaos, what it means to look clearly at the world and not turn away. He looked clearly, he did not turn away, and he made us look with him.